There is a moment when a scandal stops being noise and turns into structure, when it stops sounding like outrage and starts reading like a blueprint. That moment usually arrives quietly, not with sirens, not with breaking banners, but with a single document that doesn't argue, doesn't persuade, doesn't perform. It simply exists. And once you understand what it is, everything that happened before it rearranges itself. The losses you saw on your screen this week, the strange optimism that made no sense, the confidence with which impossible promises were spoken out loud. It all begins to align. If you were paying attention, you probably felt it before you understood it. The markets didn't just move, they lurched. Money didn't rotate, it flooded. A forgotten ticker turned radioactive almost overnight. A company with no gravity suddenly bent reality around it. And all of this happened while the most powerful office on the planet spoke an unusually precise language about ownership, control, sovereignty. Not aspirations, not negotiations, certainty. That tone alone should have raised questions. Because real deals, especially geopolitical ones, never sound that clean. What people heard was a victory. What they reacted to was authority. A head of state standing on an international stage, using the vocabulary of conquest rather than cooperation, pointing to a frozen landmass and treating it like an unlocked vault. The words landed exactly where they were designed to land. On portfolios, on pension funds, on small accounts that had been waiting for a signal strong enough to override doubt. And when that signal came, it didn't look like hype. It looked like policy. The price chart tells part of the story, but not the important part. Yes, it rose too fast. Yes, it collapsed even faster. That happens every cycle. What matters is the timing, the choreography, the way each statement arrived just as the previous rumor began to cool, the way visual symbols replaced legal texts, the way no one was allowed to read the fine print, only to see that it existed. Leather binding, thick pages, seals, weight, all the theater of legitimacy without the substance of commitment. And this is where the main thing begins, because beneath the spectacle there was pressure, not political pressure, financial pressure, deadlines that do not care about speeches or slogans, margin clocks that don't stop for applause. Somewhere behind the curtain, someone needed liquidity on a very specific schedule. Not eventually, not hypothetically, immediately. And when liquidity is needed that badly, truth becomes flexible. It looks like a trifle until you put it all together. A dormant company, a sudden narrative, a geopolitical rivalry everyone already believes in, a land everyone already knows is valuable, rare minerals, strategic choke points, national security language that had been circulating for years. All of it real, all of it legitimate. And that kernel of truth is what made the rest so dangerous. Because the lie didn't have to invent value. It only had to redirect belief. Watch the sequence carefully. First the whispers, then the suggestion that talks were advanced, then the implication that resistance was symbolic, not substantive, and finally the declaration. Control, total control, spoken not as an ambition but as a fact. At that point, the market was no longer reacting to speculation. It was reacting to authority. And authority, when misused, doesn't persuade. It commands. But they usually keep quiet about the parts that don't fit the narrative. The unanswered calls, the governments that suddenly stopped responding, the officials who didn't show up, the awkward pauses where confirmation should have been. Those silences weren't accidents, they were obstacles. And obstacles only matter if you intend to stay. If you only need a window, silence is manageable. Silence can be outrun. There is a reason the timeline feels compressed. A reason everything had to happen inside a narrow corridor of days. Deals don't expire that fast. Bubbles do. Especially when they're engineered to serve something else. Especially when the exit is already planned. Because this wasn't about building anything. It was about converting belief into cash before reality could intervene. What was actually signed? Who actually agreed? What the documents really said? Those questions were never meant to be answered in real time. They were meant to arrive later, after the trade settled, after positions were closed, after the damage had been distributed outward. By the time corrections arrived, the structure would already be gone. And that raises the uncomfortable question no one wanted to ask while the price was climbing. If this was also solid, why the rush? Why the opacity? Why the reliance on symbols instead of disclosures? Why name a specific company at the exact peak of attention? Why speak in absolutes when diplomacy lives in conditionals? Because somewhere else, something unrelated on the surface was breaking. Another market, another exposure, another bet that had gone wrong. And when systems are stressed, they don't fail in isolation. They cannibalize. They use whatever leverage is available. Even the credibility of an office. Even the trust of supporters, especially that trust. The story everyone thought they were watching was about territory, power, national destiny. But underneath it was something smaller and more ruthless. A bridge. A stopgap. A way to survive one more day without collapsing under weight no one was supposed to see. And the mechanism that made it work wasn't complicated. It was familiar. Inflate, signal, distribute, exit. The documents that surfaced this morning don't shout. They don't editorialize, they don't accuse, they map. Conversations, transfers, timing. They show intent without emotion. And once you see that structure, it becomes impossible to unsee it. Because what looked like a diplomatic announcement starts to resemble a trigger. What looked like confidence starts to resemble necessity. At that point, the question is no longer whether something was exaggerated. The question becomes whether anything presented to the public was meant to be true at all. And if the answer to that question is no, then this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a miscalculation. It was design. And right here, just before the details harden into names and numbers, is where the story has to pause. Because once you follow the money backward instead of the narrative forward, the shape of what happened changes completely. And what it points to next isn't a bad deal gone wrong, but a system that briefly turned the highest office in the country into a tool for something far more precise. Once you stop listening to the story as it was told and start reading it as it was executed, the fog lifts very quickly. The second layer is not ideological. It is mechanical. Dates line up. Transfers cluster. Language repeats itself across private channels with a consistency that public messaging never has. This is not how confusion looks. This is how coordination looks. The core mistake many people make is assuming the scheme was built around the headline. It wasn't. The headline was just the ignition. The real structure existed long before the first public word was spoken. Corporate shells stacked inside each other, jurisdictions chosen not for convenience but for opacity, beneficial ownership deliberately fragmented so that no single name appeared complete on any single document. This wasn't improvised, it was staged. Follow the internal communications and a pattern emerges. Not excitement, not celebration, anxiety. References to exposure, to positions underwater, to clocks that could not be stopped. And then suddenly a shift in tone. Confidence appears out of nowhere. Not because the risk disappeared, but because a solution had been found. A vehicle. A narrative capable of absorbing billions in a matter of hours. What made it effective was that it didn't ask people to believe something new. It leaned on what was already accepted. That Arctic resources matter. That global supply chains are fragile. That rival powers dominate materials essential to modern industry. None of that was false. The fraud wasn't in inventing value, it was in claiming ownership. And this is where the crime sharpens. Public statements were not framed as hopes or objectives. They were framed as outcomes already secured. Control was asserted before it existed. Partnerships were named before they were authorized. The language crossed a legal line very deliberately because markets don't move on nuance. They move on certainty. The certainty didn't have to last. It only had to survive long enough. Behind the scenes, assets were being offloaded into the very enthusiasm those statements created. The buying pressure wasn't organic. It was amplified. Automated accounts pushed simplified narratives. False analysis circulated just fast enough to drown out skepticism. The illusion of consensus formed, and consensus, even artificial, is irresistible to large pools of capital trained to chase momentum rather than interrogate origins. Where did the money go? That question answers everything. The proceeds didn't stay parked. They didn't wait. They moved immediately into places that had nothing to do with minerals or territory. They patched holes elsewhere. Losses in one market were neutralized with gains harvested from another. The public thought they were buying into a future. In reality, they were being used to settle a past. This explains the strange urgency. Why denials from foreign governments were dismissed rather than addressed? Why clarification was postponed instead of provided? Silence was not a problem. Time was. Every hour that passed without a full collapse was another tranche successfully transferred. By the time official contradictions became impossible to ignore, the exits were already empty. Legally, the implications are brutal, because intent is documented. Knowledge is documented. Awareness that the claims were false is documented. This is not reckless optimism. It is deliberate misrepresentation tied directly to financial benefit. The simplest statutes apply. False statements influencing market behavior. Coordinated selling by insiders. Cross-border transfers that invoke wire fraud automatically. The complexity of the structure doesn't protect anyone. It incriminates them. Politically, the damage cuts even deeper. Not because norms were violated, but because trust was inverted. The people who absorbed the losses were not adversaries. They were supporters. They were the ones conditioned to believe that participation was patriotism, that buying in was loyalty, that skepticism was betrayal. That is why the reaction is different this time. This wasn't an attack from outside, it was extraction from within. You can survive almost any scandal if your audience believes you are being persecuted on their behalf. You cannot survive convincing them to hand over their savings under false pretenses. Populism depends on an unbroken bond of protection. The moment followers realize they were treated as liquidity rather than constituents, the spell dissolves. There is also an international consequence that hasn't fully surfaced yet. Foreign governments now have documentary proof that official statements were weaponized for private financial rescue. That transforms future negotiations. Every assurance becomes suspect. Every commitment is discounted. Even allies begin to hedge, not out of hostility, but out of self-preservation. Credibility, once spent this way, does not regenerate quickly. And then there is the precedent, because this wasn't just fraud executed through markets, it was fraud executed through the apparatus of state. The merging of political authority with financial manipulation sets a template that regulators cannot ignore. It forces a response, not out of morality, but out of necessity. Systems that allow this once will invite repetition. What remains now is the slow, grinding phase where narratives collapse under paperwork, where charismatic explanations fail against timestamps, where loyalty cannot override arithmetic. The losses will be litigated, the structures will be unraveled. People will testify not because they want to, but because the alternative is silence inside a cell. But the most lasting damage won't be measured in indictments or fines. It will be measured in what no longer works. The speeches that no longer move markets. The slogans that no longer mobilize wallets. The confidence that no longer converts belief into action. Once people understand they were not participants in a national project but inputs into a balance sheet, the relationship changes permanently. This story doesn't end with closure, it ends with exposure. And exposure has a way of spreading beyond its original target. Because once the mechanism is visible, people start looking for it elsewhere. In other announcements, other surges, other moments where certainty arrives too cleanly, too loudly, too fast. And when that happens, the system that relied on unquestioned trust discovers that trust was the only asset it couldn't afford to spend. There is another layer that only becomes visible when you stop treating this as a single event and start treating it as a stress test. Because what failed here wasn't just one deal or one administration. What failed was a set of assumptions that had quietly governed the intersection of power and markets for decades. The assumption that political speech is symbolic, not transactional. The assumption that investors can distinguish propaganda from policy. The assumption that state authority cannot be directly monetized without intermediaries. Those assumptions no longer hold. What happened exposed a loophole that had always existed but was considered too dangerous, too crude, too obvious to use. The idea that if you speak from a position of absolute institutional authority, markets will treat your words not as opinion, but as inside information. And once that boundary collapses, disclosure rules, ethics codes, even constitutional norms become irrelevant details. The market reacts first, the law reacts later, sometimes much later. This is why the damage spreads outward instead of dissipating. Fund managers are now forced to reassess not just this episode, but the risk profile of any asset tied to political signaling. Sovereign risk models don't account for deliberate deception from the executive branch of a reserve currency issuer. They were never designed to. That blind spot is now visible. And markets do not forgive blind spots once they are revealed. Internally, the fallout is even more corrosive. Institutions that relied on informal trust channels are freezing. Career officials are retroactively distancing themselves from decisions they didn't question at the time because questioning them was considered disloyal. Legal departments are discovering that verbal assurances were treated as binding signals by counterparties. That realization alone will paralyze decision-making for years. There is also the matter of imitation. Once a method proves effective, it invites replication. Not necessarily by the same actors and not necessarily in the same form. Other governments are watching closely. So are private networks that operate in the gray zone between lobbying, finance, and influence operations. They are studying how long the window stayed open, how quickly money could be moved, how slow the corrective mechanisms were. This is how vulnerabilities become playbooks. And then there is the electorate, not as a moral force, but as a financial one. Millions of people were trained to treat participation in political narratives as an investment thesis. That conditioning doesn't disappear just because one trade failed. It leaves behind something more volatile, resentment mixed with technical literacy. People who now understand just enough about markets to recognize when they are being positioned as exit liquidity. That combination is unstable. The long-term consequence may not be radicalization in the traditional sense, but disengagement. A withdrawal from both markets and civic processes by people who feel used by both. That kind of retreat doesn't make noise. It doesn't protest. It hollows systems out quietly. And hollow systems collapse not from pressure, but from absence. From a historical perspective, this moment will likely be miscategorized at first. It will be called a scandal, then a fraud case, then a cautionary tale. But those labels miss the structural shift. This was the first clear demonstration that the language of sovereignty can be used as a financial derivative. That national power itself can be temporarily converted into leverage, priced, traded, and discarded. Once that idea enters circulation, it doesn't go back into the bottle. Future leaders will inherit a world where every statement is assumed to carry a hidden balance sheet, where every announcement is stress-tested not for truth but for tradability, and where credibility, once spent for short-term liquidity, becomes the most expensive asset to reacquire. Nothing about this ends cleanly. There will be prosecutions, settlements, reports, commissions. But the deeper shift has already occurred. A line was crossed publicly, profitably, and in full view of the global system. And the system responded not with immediate rejection, but with participation. That is the part that should not be ignored. Because the next time authority speaks with unnatural certainty, the question will no longer be whether it is true. The question will be who is selling, who is buying, and who is about to be left holding what everyone else already abandoned.